Associate Professor Jamus Slim.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I wish to speak today on how macroeconomic policy can and should play a role in addressing our cost of living challenges. As members of both sides of this House are aware, the state of inflation in Singapore is not good. Since the start of the year, inflation in prices faced by consumers has averaged 4.9%. This is more than double the rate of 2.3% in 2021. It's also close to double the average since our nation's independence. The pain of this rising cost of living is even more keenly felt by the average household and small business. Food inflation is up 4.5%, more than 3 times higher than last year. While news headlines and my mother's constant reminders focus on costly chicken and the threat to what most would consider our national dish, chicken rice, prices of all kinds of meat are up almost 6%. Eggs are about 30% pricier, and even those choosing a healthier diet face vegetables that are 5% more expensive. Another area where prices have shot up is energy. I'm certain I'm not the only member here who has received irate emails from residents who have expressed shock and dismay at their utilities bills. Small wonder, electricity is up 20%, dearer than it was a year ago, and gas more than 10%. This not only means that more of us have to think twice before turning the aircon on, it also means that our small businesses already operating on lower sales because of the pandemic face even thinner margins. With fuel prices up by a quarter, it's unsurprising that transportation is now more expensive, with price rises in the teens compared to a year ago. And this isn't affecting just those who have the luxury of owning cars or getting on planes for the holidays. Public transportation costs are up more than 7% for families that rely on the occasional taxi or PHC to get their kids to school when they are running late. This option has become that much more difficult. When the prices of what we eat, getting to work, and keeping our homes and businesses running are all rising rapidly, this isn't an inflation problem any longer. It is a cost of living crisis. It is therefore incumbent on policymakers to do what they can to alleviate the pain felt by the people. To be clear, the drivers of inflation are multifaceted. A significant part of inflation is global in nature. For example, the prices of commodities such as food and energy have climbed higher since the middle of last year. The war in Ukraine fed further uncertainty and led to spikes in the prices of wheat, corn, and sunflower oil. And supply chain pressures, not just in China, where the administration's stubborn adherence to a zero-COVID policy has led to rolling lockdowns, but also globally, have meant more upward pressure on prices for the rest of us. Tight labor markets worldwide have seen wages add their own powerful contribution to the inflation mix. At first glance, such imported inflation looks like something beyond our control. Since we are a small open economy, there's a price taker in global markets. But it is incorrect to insist that inflation must be a storm that we simply need allow time to pass. The experience of advanced economies that are around a half year ahead of us in confronting the price dragon suggests that inflation may, like the last drunk, uninvited guest at a party, hang around longer than we'll like or appreciate. Their central banks have already abandoned rhetoric that the phenomenon is transitory. None other than our own MAS has pointed out that only a third of the increase in core inflation is due to external sources, with about half due to domestic drivers. With the source of inflation emanating domestically, it behooves us to act locally. There are genuine consequences for failing to act. In addition to the real costs borne by various segments of the population, refraining from decisive action now could allow inflation to become even more entrenched in expectations of our households and businesses. This runs the risk that inflation becomes more permanent than temporary. The role of macroeconomic policy is to stabilize the economy. While the government has announced a suite of measures in an off-budget fiscal package, I believe more can be done at this juncture from a big picture perspective. In most economies, the first line of defense against inflation is the central bank. But as explained yesterday by DPM Wong, our nation's central bank, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, does not operate as a traditional central bank, relying on short-term interest rates to manage price pressures. Instead, it subordinates the policy rate to exchange rate considerations, consistent with our open economy and considerable exposure to international trade and financial flows. Now, regardless of whether one agrees with this approach, I, for one, do, it is also well understood that having adopted such a target, we can no longer control inflation via traditional interest rate hikes. But thankfully, this does not mean that there are no other tools in the Monetary Authority's toolkit. One strategy, developed in recent decades, is to intervene in markets for financial assets. Some of us may be familiar with the process of quantitative easing, or QE. Central bank makes large-scale asset purchases to keep long-term interest rates low. The objective of QE is to stimulate the economy in the face of interest rates that are close to zero. Over the past decade, QE was applied by major developed economy central banks, such as the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, and the US Federal Reserve, with some success. Quantitative tightening, or QT, is essentially the opposite. Central bank will intervene in markets to sell longer-term government bonds. This will bid down their prices and conversely raise their yield. Thus, even though the MAS does not directly seek to increase the Singapore cash rate, currently at 0.7%, it could nonetheless influence interest rates for government bonds maturing 10 years or later. Whether via QT or other means, it strikes me as eminently reasonable that MAS attempts to elevate such long rates so that the real interest rate, that is the interest rate net of inflation, would no longer be negative, as it currently is. This would represent a genuine tightening of monetary conditions, which is what is necessary to contain inflation. Of course, the most direct approach to controlling inflation in the context of our current policy framework is to have MAS target a stronger Singapore dollar. Ma'am, I appreciate that the legislature is seldom the place for in-depth discussion about as esoteric a topic as the appropriate level of the exchange rate. I'm also keenly sensitive to how the Monetary Authority operates best when left relatively free rein over how they conduct the more technical elements of monetary and exchange rate policy. That said, as I shared with this House earlier this year, while the execution of policy is indeed best left to experts, the choice of what policy to pursue falls appropriately within the domain of politicians who are best positioned to debate the relative merits of trade-offs that affect the welfare of the people we represent. It is with this in mind that I'm broaching the issue of our exchange rate. I believe that we can do more to strengthen the Singapore dollar. This will reduce the costs of imported goods and services. And since much of what we consume is imported, a strong Sing dollar can in turn lower domestic inflation as well. As Minister of State Alvin Tan shared with this House 2 months ago, and again yesterday, MAS is aware of this and had already tightened monetary policy thrice since October last year. But it's unclear how much this effort to strengthen the Sing dollar has succeeded. This is because of the 3 moves, only the most recent one was sufficiently aggressive, involving an adjustment of not just the slope, but also the midpoint of the policy band, while the other 2 were more limited. Ultimately, the proof is in the pudding. On October 14th, the day of the first MAS announcement, the exchange rate between the US and Singapore dollar was 135. As of mid-June, after 3 separate efforts, this was 140, getting close to 4% weaker than when the exercise first started. Now, there are many reasons why this may be the case, not least because the US dollar has been exceptionally strong, even compared to other currencies. But the reality for this is that the Sing dollar is today weaker in terms of the currency that global commodities like oil, gas, and agricultural products are priced in, which is the USD. This translates into higher prices here as higher input prices pass through into domestic inflation. The efforts of the MAS are demonstrably too tentative. And what's worse, we will risk falling behind the curve even further as the Federal Reserve recently moved to hike interest rates more aggressively, which will further fuel appreciation of the US dollar unless we act more aggressively ourselves. Sure, such a policy will entail winners and losers. We will be concerned about what the effects of a strong exchange rate could mean for exports. But there are reasons to believe that currency appreciation needn't be that problematic in our modern Singapore economy. We should not forget our entrepot model and natural resource scarcity means that our producers often import raw materials and other intermediate inputs to production, which all benefit from a stronger Sing dollar. Our economy is also less reliant on manufacturing than before. And indeed, a number of our tradable services in finance, ICT, and professional services have pricing power, which allows them to be more resilient to exchange rate fluctuations. By a similar token, capital inflows may also remain unaffected by currency appreciation and could even potentially increase. After all, multinationals based here can manage their foreign exchange rate risk through hedging, as long as the plans for doing so are telegraphed in advance. And in the long run, a stronger currency may provide the impetus for our local firms to finally upgrade their operations to reflect higher productivity and quality, rather than competing solely on low prices and cost cutting. There are, of course, reasons for caution on this front. Even casual students of international economic history will have encountered the Plaza Accord, an agreement struck between then leading nations to intervene in currency markets to strengthen the Japanese yen and the German Deutsche Mark relative to the US dollar. The result was a success, but some observers have argued that the concerted intervention set in motion the Japanese real estate and stock market bubble and the economy's subsequent lost decades. We do not want that here, but even so, there's ample evidence that we can afford more strengthening of the Sing dollar. Standard metrics for comparing the under and overvaluation of our currency suggest that the Sing dollar is indeed significantly undervalued. There's latent demand for the Sing dollar as an attractive safe haven currency in these tumultuous times. Hence, paradoxically, we may not even need to spend that much to prop up our currency. It may be as simple as seizing interventions that restrain our exchange rate and allowing foreign exchange markets to work more efficiently. This is a luxury that precious few countries can afford, but one that we can leverage on now. Now, these monetary and exchange rate moves should occur alongside fiscal policy. I will suggest three general principles that guide our thinking on this matter. First, we should subscribe to the general principle of being timely, targeted, and temporary. I've already outlined why support is needed now, and so it is timely given how a souring of the global economic environment means that we must rely less on global growth tailwinds to support our economy. Targeting specific groups and keeping the policy temporary will also minimize the budgetary footprint at a time where we've already drawn liberally from reserves, and the economy is on track toward a self-sustaining recovery. Second, our fiscal balances should not be building up excess surpluses at this time. This means that increased revenues resulting from higher collections of various taxes and duties should, as far as possible, be rebated back to citizens. This ensures that our government does not enjoy a windfall gain while our citizens suffer. Finally, it's important that we avoid the temptation to index economy-wide wages to inflation. While tempting, since it automates the process of wage adjustment to rising inflation, the experience of emerging markets in the 1980s and 1990s are a testament that this well-meaning policy can end up institutionalizing inflation. While the package announced last month by the Ministry of Finance is based on three somewhat different philosophies, it also embeds some of the principles that I mentioned of being temporary and targeted, and relying on better-than-expected fiscal outturns from the prior fiscal year. But we can probably do more. Revenue for the previous fiscal year, FY 2021, was $74.8 billion, 13.4 billion higher than fiscal 2020, and 7.1 billion more than 2 years ago, before the pandemic. The jump in property stamp duty alone was 6.8 billion, even as personal and corporate income taxes have fully recovered. Yet the announced package only amounts to 1.5 billion, a fraction of this revenue increase. Now, one important example of policy that follows these principles is to make adjustments for Singaporeans on fixed incomes. For such people, inflation can be devastating. An elderly person spending $20 a day may now only be able to buy 1 prata instead of 2 for breakfast, be forced to skip their afternoon tea, or order 2 instead of 3 items of taipam. And what's worse, this diminished consumption will be with them for the rest of their lives, even when inflation has returned to normal rates, because elevated prices do not automatically come back down even when inflation disappears. Inflation 3% above the historical average will mean that their retirement funds now buy 3% less. In practical terms, this means adjustments to those that rely on ComCare and CPF. We have to remind ourselves that while financial markets can and do adjust returns to reflect higher inflation, this is not the case for those locked into a fixed income stream. For retirees, CPF returns have remained unchanged thus far, even as higher prices mean that whatever these retirees have set aside in saving will now buy less. For ComCare, the announced increase for long-term assistance is surely welcome, but it is unclear why a comparable degree of support is not extended for short and medium-term assistance, since inflation hits both types of households in much the same way. I believe that ComCare assistance should be permanently and universally increased by a margin that reflects the excess inflation experienced by families for this year. I also believe that we can roll out a temporary increase in CPF interest rates of around 2 percentage points for a 6-month period, consistent with an increase in inflation. This can be funded by the returns paid on Special Singapore Government Securities, or SGSS. The higher returns on SGS, can in turn be made up from higher nominal returns that will accrue from financial assets that are marked to market. Macroeconomic policies are often viewed as blunt instruments. They affect the economy on the aggregate, and hence we may be concerned that pushing these levers may be too disruptive for an economy that's already on a tentative road to recovery. On the contrary, my contention is that it is precisely because the effects of macro policy are wide-ranging that we wish to consider applying such tools at this time. For starters, a number of the policies that I discuss associated with interest and exchange rates have the benefit of being fast to implement. Budgetary measures take time to draw up and disburse. In contrast, interest and exchange rate policies can be rolled out once the decision has been made. Moreover, the suggestions I made are complementary in nature. The monetary policy measures deployed to cool inflation are contractionary, as they should be by design. To limit the risk of derailing a still fragile economy and recovery, we should offset this effect with fiscal measures that are modestly expansionary. The government's support package is consistent with this, but this risks being unwound by the impending GST hike. Instead, what we want is a macro policy stance that is broadly neutral, which is what is appropriate for our economy at this stage of the business cycle. Put another way, we want to downshift and tap on the brakes to contain inflation, but pumping on a wee bit of gas with limited government spending that helps keep the engine from stalling. Madam Deputy Speaker, I appreciate that most of this speech has been relatively technical, and we all want to go home. To some extent, this is inevitable. The nature of macroeconomic policymaking is often technical in nature. Nevertheless, it's possible to summarize my main suggestions in a few sentences. Strengthen the Singapore dollar, because a strong currency makes the stuff we import cheaper. Buy long bonds, because this will dampen speculative investment and keep a lid on asset prices. Spend to support those among us that are hurting the most for a temporary period, and finance this by rebating any windfall tax gains, but avoid wage indexation at all costs. We need to battle inflation proactively, and we have the tools to do so. Let's use them.
Minister of State Alvin Tan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the member for tabling today's motion. I will respond to the motion in two parts. I will start by addressing the macro picture before zooming in to the micro picture. Now, a hallmark of our government since our independence has been our ability to look long-term. We see the big picture, the macro picture. This includes assessing the world and the winds of change, as well as identifying the trends, opportunities, and challenges for Singapore. In this House yesterday, I shared our economic outlook for Singapore, including our GDP growth and inflation projections. Now, for the sake of brevity in this response, I shall not repeat those details, and members can refer to my speech yesterday. What I would like to focus on in my response is how we have planned for and laid foundations for the long term. First, we maintain a stable macroeconomic environment so businesses and households can make economic decisions with confidence. And a core tenet is our exchange rate-centered monetary policy, which has helped us manage inflation. And during this period of rising inflationary pressures, the MAS has preemptively tightened monetary policy since October last year, as the member has observed. Now, this long-standing policy has directly helped dampen imported inflation. How? To the Associate Professor's point on food prices as well as energy prices, let me dive deeper. For global food prices, while global food commodity prices increased by an average of 25.4% year-on-year over the first 5 months of 2022, domestic food prices increased by an average of 3.6% year-on-year over the same period. 25.4%, 3.6%. On energy prices, likewise, even as global energy prices rose by 27.5%, energy-related components in Singapore's Consumer Price Index, which include the cost of electricity, gas and petrol, increased by 13.6% year-on-year between January and May. 27.5%, 13.6%. Second, we continue to build our trade links to the world, to diversify our sources of imports and exports, even as the world is experiencing a retreat of globalization. We concluded the world's largest free trade agreement, RCEP, in November 2020, and are part of the CPTPP. We have also signed the Pacific Alliance Singapore Free Trade Agreement in January and are on track to conclude an FTA with Mercosur. We have also signed digital economy agreements, digital economy partnership agreements, and are in the process of negotiating a green economy agreement with Australia. Now, these agreements help us to diversify our imports, open markets for our businesses, and future-proof our economy. Third, we continue to stay open and connected to the world, and to innovation, investments, and talent. And despite the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, we attracted 11.8 billion Singapore dollars in fixed asset investments last year. We have also secured significant investments. For example, Sanofi has committed to setting up a euro $400 million vaccine production facility in Singapore. Now, these inbound investments create good jobs for Singaporeans, make our economy vibrant and competitive, and prepare us for the next pandemic. Long term. Overall, strong growth will support job creation, wage growth, and help address inflationary pressures. So, as we continue to plan and execute our macro and strategic plans, we also keep our eye firmly on the micro, the ground picture. So, macro, plan, execute, but also keep our eye firmly on what's happening on the ground. It's reflected in how we navigated Singapore through the COVID crisis and support Singaporeans and local businesses during this period of rising costs. Now, during the height of COVID, we committed close to $100 billion over the last 2 years, part of it to support businesses hit by COVID restrictions. In particular, our job support scheme, which provided wage subsidies to employers to help them retain workers, saved 165,000 local jobs between March and December 2020. We also rolled out initiatives such as our Singapore Rediscovers vouchers for our embattled tourism sector, and collectively about $300 million in vouchers and out-of-pocket payments were generated through SRV transactions. And this provided crucial support to our local tourism business. In anticipation of higher prices, we rolled out support for Singaporeans in Budget 2022, including the Jobs and Business Support Package to help businesses and workers, as well as the Household Support Package to help households with their daily needs. And to help Singaporeans cope with rising inflationary pressures, we also brought forward the implementation of some of the measures, including our CDC vouchers and our Small Business Recovery Grant. The additional 1.5 billion support package DPM Lawrence Wong announced on 21st June provides immediate and targeted relief to low-income and vulnerable Singaporeans who are disproportionately affected by higher prices. The measures included in the package also help our local companies transform and cope with rising energy costs, becoming more energy efficient. It also provides targeted relief for specific groups, such as self-employed persons who depend on their vehicles for livelihoods and hence are more adversely affected by energy cost increases. These include taxi drivers and delivery drivers. Overall, we designed the package to avoid stoking further inflationary pressures and distorting price signals, while being, as the member suggested, fiscally responsible and sustainable. And as DPM Wong said yesterday, if the situation worsens significantly, we will be prepared to do more. Now let me turn into some of the specific issues raised by Associate Professor James Lim in his speech on MAS's monetary policy response to inflation. Well, specifically, we need to recognize that the global nature of the price pressures we are facing, which is affecting all of our trading partners. The sharp pickup of inflation of food and oil prices since Q4 last year principally reflects the effects of serious disruptions of global supply, including due to the Ukraine-Russia conflict. So it's inevitable, as the member had mentioned, that some of these prices will affect our economy. Many Singaporeans do accept that the situation requires some adjustments to the higher prices, and given the circumstances, I will explain a few points below. Well, the MAS, using its monetary policy, has strengthened the exchange rate by at least 5% on an annualized basis, which has kept domestic food inflation, for example, to one-fifth of global food inflation thus far. And when the MAS decides to extend in how the MAS is deciding to the extent of tightening the exchange rate takes many different factors into account. Foremost is the fact that the strengthening exchange rate cannot fully offset global prices without causing immediate negative consequences on growth and therefore the labour market. Indeed, this is precisely the reason why many advanced central banks are guarded in the speed and also the extent to which they will hike interest rates. This monetary policy action in of themselves have attendant spillover effects that we must all take into account in a very uncertain, dynamic, and also challenging economic environment. Therefore, a judicious blend of tight monetary policy and targeted supportive fiscal policy, carefully calibrated, is most appropriate. In fact, the member mentioned that the fiscal policy must be timely, targeted, temporary. In rebating back fiscal upsides, that's what we've precisely done with the $1.5 billion support package. And if you look at it, the combined budgets of 2020-21 together with monetary policy decisions, both fiscal and monetary policy together, supported Singapore's GDP growth by about 1 percentage point in 2021 and prevented the deterioration of unemployment rate by 4 percentage points, even as the combined expansionary monetary macroeconomic policy responses was non-inflationary. And at this juncture, the current round of combined fiscal and monetary policy responses is expected to contain medium-term inflation without significant loss of output or inadvertently adding further to the underlying tightness in the economy. On indexing financial assistance payments to inflation, I would like just to say that the government regularly reviews our schemes to take into account needs and affordability, and inflation is one of the many factors taken into consideration. Madam Deputy Speaker, allow me to sum up. I've responded to the member's notion by articulating our government's macro and micro approach. We plan and execute for the long term, and at the same time, continue to have the dexterity to zoom in into the details that matter on the ground to Singaporeans and to Singaporean businesses. Indeed, the livelihoods of our people are not a theoretical exercise to us. Rather, we focus on strong job creation and wage growth as the best ways to help Singaporeans tide through these immediate difficult times and ensure that we have sufficient resources to tackle the long-term challenges. The mindset and bias towards action have allowed us to weather storms and seize opportunities throughout our history. That is the hallmark of our government. This is our commitment to Singapore, and we will continue to do our utmost to deliver on this commitment, especially in these challenging times. Thank you.
Order. The time allowed for the proceedings has expired. I adjourn the House pursuant to the standing order. Order, order.